This chapter, it's kind of almost like a unit because we're going to combine two chapters into this. We're going to look at the reproductive system, and we'll first start off looking with the male and female reproductive system and how they share common features. Then it will move into the anatomy and physiology of the male reproductive system, and then the anatomy and physiology of the female reproductive chapter. We will look at sexually transmitted diseases and how these infections cause reproductive and other disorders. We'll specifically look at infectious agents such as the transmission of chlamydia, trichomoniasis, gonorrhea, syphilis, genital warts, and also genital herpes. Then we will move into the next chapter, which is pregnancy and human development, and we'll just have a brief coverage of that. Included in here is an introductory video to the reproductive system. Again, read your chapter.
The male reproductive system. Now, most people are familiar with the external structures of the male reproductive system, but there's actually a lot of structures inside that people are less familiar with. In this video, we're going to look at all of those different structures of the male reproductive system, what each of them does, and how they're all connected to each other and to other structures in the urinary system. And then we'll identify all of those structures on the torso model to get a better idea of their three-dimensional orientation inside of the pelvic cavity. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. So here we have a sagittal cross-section of the pelvic area. We can see a leg back here, we can see the penis, the scrotum, and we can also see the colon and the anus where the colon connects to the outside of the body. Posterior to the colon, we have vertebrae of the spinal cord. And here on the anterior side, we have the front of the pelvis, or really the cartilage between the two halves of the pelvis, as you can see on Mortimer here. The main reason that I include these structures in the diagram is to give us a better understanding of where the male reproductive structures are in relation to nearby organs. The first structure we'll talk about are the testes. The testes are the primary sex organ in the male reproductive system, and they're the site of spermatogenesis, or the creation of sperm cells. Before they technically become sperm cells, these cells called spermatocytes will undergo meiosis, which is going to reduce their number of chromosomes from the normal 46 down to 23. Most of the cells in the human body have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes. But after undergoing the process of meiosis, that number is reduced down to 23 individual chromosomes. Whenever fertilization of an egg cell occurs, 23 chromosomes will come from the sperm cell and 23 chromosomes from the egg cell, creating a new combination of 46 chromosomes for that new zygote. Inside the testes are these long coiled tubes called the seminiferous tubules. As these spermatocytes travel through the seminiferous tubules, they'll undergo these processes of mitosis and meiosis, and they'll eventually develop into mature sperm cells that have the potential to fertilize an egg. Now, before we move on, let's take a look at the structure of the sperm cell itself. The sperm cell will have a head, which will contain the nucleus, and that's where all the genetic material, those 23 chromosomes, are going to be located. In the body of the sperm cell, there's going to be a mitochondria that's shaped in this strange sort of coil pattern, and that's going to help provide the sperm cell with the energy that it needs. And finally, there's the tail. The tail is in a coil, and it's going to rotate and spin. That coiled rotation of the tail will help that cell travel through the female reproductive tract for fertilization if sexual intercourse has occurred. A couple fun facts about the sperm cells: they can only make left turns because of the direction that their tail rotates. Another interesting fact is that sperm cells are the smallest human cells in the body, and egg cells are actually the largest human cell in the body. And whereas the egg cells have a lot of nutrients already built into the cell itself, the sperm cells have to get all of their energy from sugar that's found in the fluid that surrounds the sperm cells. Now, this process of spermatogenesis, or the production of sperm cells, takes place at a slightly lower temperature than the body's normal internal temperature. And because of that, the testes must hang outside of the body in a sac called the scrotum. The scrotum is essentially a patch of skin that's going to help regulate the temperature of the testes to maximize sperm cell production. Whenever it's cold, the scrotum will contract and pull those testes up closer to the body to keep them warm. And whenever it's warm, then the scrotum will relax so those testes can keep farther from the warmer temperatures of the internal body. The testes also produce testosterone, the primary male sex hormone. They're not drawn in the diagram, but there's lots of blood cells that go to the testes. And whenever the testes produce testosterone, it's not going to go through the other tubes that I'm about to talk about. The hormone will travel directly into the bloodstream straight from the testes. The sperm cells, however, follow a different path. They're going to travel next through a structure called the epididymis. The epididymis starts at the top or superior part of the testes, and then it's going to travel down and then back up to the vas deferens. The epididymis is basically an extension of those seminiferous tubules where the sperm cells will continue to grow and mature and develop until they're ready for ejaculation. Now, during sexual arousal and then ejaculation, the sperm cells will travel up through a tube called the vas deferens. The vas deferens extends from the testes and the epididymis upward, anterior to that pelvic bone, and then posterior to the back. Connected to the back or the posterior part of the vas deferens are a pair of glands called the seminal vesicles. That word seminal is the same root as semen, and the seminal vesicles are going to produce some of the fluid that the sperm travel through during ejaculation. And to clarify a couple terms here, sperm refers to the cells produced by the testes that carry genetic information, whereas semen refers to both the fluid and the cells that travel during ejaculation. The semen acts as lubrication for the sperm cells to travel, as well as providing nutrients that supply the sperm with the energy that they need. And just past the seminal vesicle, the two vas deferens will join with the urethra, which is connected to the bladder. So here's the bladder, which of course stores urine until it's ready to be expelled during urination. And the bladder is connected to the kidneys by two tubes called ureters, which will bring the fluid from the kidneys down to the bladder to be stored. You can see that here in the diagram as well. This spot where the two vas deferens join together with the urethra is also surrounded by a gland called the prostate gland. The prostate, just like the seminal vesicle, will secrete some of the fluid that makes up the semen that the sperm travel through. Now, the prostate gland in the male reproductive system is a common site of a couple disorders, an enlarged prostate or even prostate cancer. And after a certain age, men need to have their prostates checked. So let's talk real quick about prostate exams. Notice on the diagram the location of the prostate. It's really close to the colon, but it's pretty far from everywhere else. And so how does a physician check a prostate to see if it's enlarged or if there's a chance of prostate cancer? Well, they can test through a digital examination, or in other words, inserting the finger up through the anus into the colon and feeling for the anterior side of the prostate. And that way they can tell if the prostate gland is larger than it should be, which is indicative of prostate cancer or an enlarged prostate. Oftentimes, one of the first symptoms of an enlarged prostate or prostate cancer is difficulty urinating. So let's think about why that would be. We'll notice that the prostate surrounds the urethra just below the bladder. If that prostate is enlarged, it's going to be pushing on the walls of the urethra, making it really difficult for urine to travel through the urethra and out of the body. Just inferior to the prostate is a pair of glands called the Cowper's glands or the bulbourethral glands. Bulbo because they're shaped like a bulb, and urethral because they're attached to the urethra. Just like the prostate and the seminal vesicle, the bulbourethral glands will secrete part of the fluid that makes up the semen. From there, the urethra extends through the shaft of the penis and then out to the outside of the body. The penis, of course, is the main delivery system of the sperm. Basically, the sperm travel through the penis and outside of the body during ejaculation. The end or the head of the penis is referred to the glans penis. And here surrounding the glans penis is the foreskin, which sometimes gets removed during circumcision. If we want to follow the path of sperm traveling from the testes to the outside of the body, it would go like this. The sperm are made in the testes. They'll develop as they travel through those seminiferous tubules, through the epididymis, and then they'll travel up through the vas deferens, then back, and then down. There they'll mix with semen, which is produced by the seminal vesicle, prostate, and bulbourethral glands. And then from the vas deferens, they'll connect to the urethra, where the sperm will travel out through the penis. To follow the path of urine out of the body, urine will of course start in the kidney, travel down through the ureters into the bladder, where it's stored. Then during urination, the bladder will contract, and that'll expel the urine down through the urethra to the outside of the body. And just as a reminder, testosterone doesn't travel through any of this. Testosterone goes straight from the testes into the bloodstream where it travels throughout the body. Speaking of which, while I've got this diagram up, let's talk about vasectomies. During a vasectomy, the doctor will make a little incision in through the scrotum, and they'll make a cut into the vas deferens, hence vasectomy, or cutting of the vas deferens. When the two ends of the vas deferens are cut and tied off, then suddenly sperm are not able to exit the body through that vas deferens. Any sperm that are produced will just break down and be absorbed. Now, somebody deciding to have a vasectomy might have some concerns about this. They could wonder, will ejaculation still happen? And the answer is yes. If you notice, the path of semen traveling from the prostate gland and the seminal vesicle and the bulbourethral gland is not obstructed by the vasectomy. They could also wonder about testosterone. Would a vasectomy reduce their body's ability to make and release testosterone? The answer to that is no as well. Because remember, the testosterone doesn't travel through the vas deferens at all. It just goes straight to the bloodstream from the testes. Now let's take a look at Terry the torso model's reproductive system and see what these structures look like three-dimensionally in the body. So let's start with the external structures that we can see. Here we have the glans penis as well as the shaft of the penis. We have the scrotum, which is going to surround the testes, and we have the epididymis just above the testes right here. You'll notice here in the scrotum we have these red lines, which are muscles, which will pull the testes up closer to the body or let them go farther away from the body depending on the temperature. So sperm cells will grow in the testes, they'll mature in the epididymis, and they're going to travel up the vas deferens, which runs up here. You can see the vas deferens better on this side as it travels this way, and then on this side the vas deferens travels back this way. And the two vas deferens are going to run in front of the pelvic bone, which we can see right there. So as the sperm travel up through the vas deferens, they're going to reach back here, the seminal vesicles, where the seminal fluid or semen gets released. And then the vas deferens will converge back here. I can open up the model here and we can see a little bit better. Here's the prostate gland, and there's the little tube. That's the vas deferens where it's connecting to the urethra. We have the bladder here. And here on the side, we can see that's going to be one of the ureters that connects up to the kidney. Back over here, we can follow the urethra as it travels down through the prostate gland. Here's going to be the bulbourethral gland, that tiny little gland right there. And then the urethra travels down through here and then out through the shaft of the penis. Back here, of course, you see the colon, which is really close to the prostate gland. And then there is the anus. I can also show a cross section of the inside of the penis, which looks like this. It's going to have the urethra, which travels through right there, and that's where urine and semen both travel through. These other two sections right here and right here are blood sinuses. During an erection, the arteries in those areas will expand and blood will rush into the penis during the erection. So to recap all of those structures again, we have the scrotum, the testes, the epididymis. That's going to connect to the vas deferens, which runs along here. We have the seminal vesicle. The vas deferens will connect right here to the urethra. That's in the prostate gland. Here's the bladder. We've got the ureter back over on this side. The urethra extends down through here. There's the Cowper's or bulbourethral gland. And then the urethra extends the rest of the way down through the penis. All right, that was a lot of different structures. Take a moment, pause the video, and see if you can identify all of the structures of the male reproductive system, as well as what each structure does. First, we have the testes, which are the primary sex organ of the male reproductive system. They'll produce testosterone, as well as produce and develop sperm. The sperm cells travel through the epididymis, where they mature and develop. And both the testes and the epididymis are contained within the scrotum, which is going to help regulate the temperature of the testes. During ejaculation, sperm will travel through the vas deferens, and those sperm will pass by the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral or Cowper's gland, which all produce some of the fluid that makes up the semen. And here on the diagram, we have the bladder, which is connected to the kidneys via the ureters, and the urethra extends down from the bladder. It'll connect to the vas deferens in the prostate gland, and then run to the outside of the body through the penis. The head of the penis is referred to as the glans penis, and it's surrounded by the foreskin. The female reproductive system. Every person watching this video was developed in a female reproductive system before you were born. It's sort of our first home if you think about it. In this video, we're going to take a look at the internal structures of the female reproductive system. Then we're going to take a look at the external genitalia, and then we'll come back to the torso model to take a look three-dimensionally at how these structures are arranged. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. Here in the sagittal cross-section, we can see a leg. On the anterior side, we see part of the pelvic bone, or really the cartilage between the two halves of the pelvis. On the posterior side, we have the colon, as well as the anus, where the colon connects to the outside of the body. And then we have the spine drawn posterior to that. Those are just some of the nearby structures on the sagittal view to help us see where these reproductive organs are. Here on the anterior side of the sagittal cross-section, just inferior to the pelvic bone, is the clitoris. The clitoris is composed of erectile tissue, which will fill with blood during sexual stimulation and arousal. It's actually a homologous structure to the male penis. I'm going to refer to several homologous structures throughout this video. Any homologous structure means that a fetus, when it's developing before sexual differentiation, in other words, before the sexual organs of the fetus develop into the male form or the female form, they start as the same structure. So there's an undifferentiated organ in the fetus that'll either become the glans of the penis or it becomes the clitoris, depending on the presence of more testosterone or more estrogen during development of the fetus. Just posterior to the clitoris, we have the urethra. The urethra in the female reproductive system is very short. It's going to run from the outside of the body just up to the bladder. The bladder here, of course, is connected to the kidneys via 2 ureters. So, of course, whenever the kidneys filter out water and waste from the blood, which we call urine, that urine will travel down the ureters into the bladder, and then during urination, that urine will travel from the bladder through the urethra to the outside of the body. If you remember, in the male reproductive system, the urethra is connected to the male reproductive system via the vas deferens. But in the female reproductive system, the urinary tract is kept separate from the reproductive parts. Now, anterior to the urethra is the vagina. The vagina extends from the outside of the body superiorly to the uterus. The vagina is primarily composed of elastic tissue which can extend. Now, surrounding the vagina are 2 glands called the Bartholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. The primary function of the Bartholin's or greater vestibular gland is to produce mucus to lubricate the vagina. Now, on the most superior part of the vagina, right where it connects to the uterus, there's this U-shaped part right here, and that's called the fornix. The most posterior and inferior part of the uterus, where it connects to the vagina, is called the cervix. And cervical cancer is cancer of the cervix, or this part of the uterus that connects to the vagina right here. Now, here we have the uterus. The uterus is going to be the site of development of an embryo and then a fetus during a pregnancy. Now, there's different parts of the uterus. We have the fundus, we have the body of the uterus, and then the cervix of the uterus. And this internal part, or the inside lining of the uterus, is called the endometrium. During menstruation, that endometrium, or that internal lining of the uterus, is what comes out through the vaginal canal during menstruation or during the period. Extending out from the uterus on either side are the fallopian tubes, and here at the end of the fallopian tubes are the ovaries. The ovaries are the site of oogenesis, yep, 2 O's there, which is the process of development of an egg cell to get ready for fertilization. These sort of pre-egg cells that we call oocytes undergo the process of meiosis, where they're reduced from the 46 chromosomes down to 23 chromosomes. Then during fertilization, 23 chromosomes will come from the egg, 23 from the sperm, to create a new set of 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes for that zygote. That process of releasing an egg from the ovary is called ovulation. When ovulation occurs, an egg cell will get released from the ovary and it'll travel through the fallopian tube. If sexual intercourse happens and sperm cells enter into the uterus, those sperm cells will fertilize the egg while the egg is in the fallopian tube. If the egg cell gets fertilized and becomes a zygote, then that zygote will split into 2 cells, and then into 4 cells, and into 8 cells, and so on. Eventually, whenever that ball of cells reaches the uterus, it'll implant into the endometrium, where it's going to get nutrients from the mother's bloodstream, and it'll continue growing and becoming an embryo and then a fetus. If fertilization does not occur, then that egg cell will break down while it's in the fallopian tube, and then it will just come out during menstruation with the rest of the endometrium. Besides oogenesis and ovulation, the ovary is going to produce 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So while I've got this diagram up, let's talk about tubal ligations. A tubal ligation is a type of female contraception that's very similar to a vasectomy, where the vas deferens is cut. In a tubal ligation, the fallopian tubes are cut and they're tied off, and that way sperm cells and egg cells cannot meet in the middle for fertilization. Of course, this has no effect on estrogen and progesterone production by the ovaries. The ovaries are surrounded by lots of blood vessels, and those hormones enter directly into the bloodstream from the ovaries via those blood vessels. Ovulation still occurs, menstruation still occurs. The main difference is that fertilization can't occur. Another common procedure is called a hysterectomy. A hysterectomy is a full removal of the uterus itself. This, of course, acts as a permanent contraception. There's going to be no fertilization of an egg cell. It would also cause menstruation to not to happen because the uterus itself is gone. A lot of times that's performed if somebody's at a higher risk of cervical cancer, because cervical cancer is cancer of the cervix. So if you remove that whole organ, then cervical cancer can't occur. Okay, now let's zoom out to the outside of the body and take a look at the external structures of the female reproductive system. Here we have the left leg, and here we have the right leg. Here's the anterior side, or the front, and then here's the posterior side, or the back of this region. This whole region here is called the vulva. All of these structures that I'm about to show collectively are called that, the vulva. Starting with the outside here, we have the labia majora, and inside of that we have the labia minora. The labia majora are larger skin folds that are often covered with hair, and inside of that are smaller skin folds called the labia minora, which are usually smooth and hairless. Here at the top of the diagram, or the most anterior part of this, is the clitoris. And the clitoris is covered by the clitoral fold. The clitoral fold is a homologous structure with the foreskin of the penis in the male reproductive system. Posterior to this, or below this on the diagram, is the urethral opening. And just posterior or below that in this diagram is the vaginal opening. On either side of the vaginal opening are going to be those Bertholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. And finally, posterior to all of that is the anus. So again, this whole area is called the vulva. We have the labia majora, the labia minora. We have the clitoris, the urethra, the vaginal opening, and the anus. All right, now let's jump back to the torso model and take a look at the three-dimensional structure of all of these. All right, so I've got the female reproductive system model here. Let's take a look. Let's start with the external structures. Here we're going to have the labia majora, and then just inside that we're going to have the labia minora. You can see it a little bit better if I open this up here. So labia majora, and then the labia minora just inside that. And this whole area is called the vulva. If we look from the superior part, we can see several structures. We have the uterus right here. We have the ovary and the fallopian tube on that side, and the ovary and the fallopian tube on this other side. And on the model, we can open up part of the uterus here to take a look inside there. Of course, this inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. And here's where that uterus connects to the fallopian tube on either side. If we could see down farther, we'd see where the cervix is. So uterus, the ovary, and fallopian tube. So let's take the model and let's open it up and look at the sagittal cross section right here. Starting with the anterior side, we have the clitoris, which is the erectile tissue. We have the urethra, which connects to the bladder. Here we have the vaginal opening and the vagina. The Bartholin's or greater vestibular glands, we can't see these on this diagram here because they would be either here closer to the camera or on the other side of the vagina. Here is the fornix, where it sort of makes that U shape. And then we have the uterus. This bottom part of the uterus is called the cervix, the body of the uterus, and the fundus. If I remove this, we can see it a little bit better. Then we have the fallopian tube, which comes around and wraps to the ovary. If you look here, you'll see another piece of tissue that connects from the ovary to the uterus. That's actually the ovarian ligament, and that's just going to help hold the ovary in place. We also have something called the broad ligament, which is going to hold all of these structures in place as well. And then here in the back, we have the colon and the anus. All right, let's do a quick recap. Take a look at this sagittal and frontal cross section. Pause the video and see if you can identify all of the structures as well as what they do. Starting with the anterior side, we have the clitoris, which is erectile tissue. We have the urethra, which connects up to the bladder. We have the vagina or the vaginal canal, the Bartholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. Here's the cervix, which is the part of the uterus that's closest to the vagina. Here we have the uterus, which includes the fundus, the body, and the cervix. We have the inner lining of the uterus called the endometrium. That's going to be the part that develops during the menstrual cycle and then is menstruated or shed during menstruation. We have the fallopian tubes, which connect the uterus to the ovaries. The ovaries are the site of oogenesis and ovulation, where an egg gets released, where it has the chance to be fertilized by a sperm cell. Finally, in the posterior part of the diagram, we have the colon as well as the anus. Now, pause the video again and see if you can identify the external structures of the female reproductive system. Here we have the labia majora and the labia minora. Here is the clitoris. Below this on the diagram is the urethral opening. Here's the vaginal opening, and finally the anus.